Our next speaker is Perry Dane, who is a professor of law at Rutgers University, Camden, where he teaches conflict of laws, religion and law, and legal theory. He's a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School, and he clerked for Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. He has won the Driver Award for previous presentations at NAVA, and he is on the editorial board of Raven. Today, he poses the question, what banner shall we raise on scholarship and vexillology? Perry Dane.
Thank you. Thank you. The world of vexillology has seen two important debates over the years. The first debate concerns the proper scope of vexillology. On one side are purists inspired by Whitney Smith, who want to define vexillology as the, quote, scientific or scholarly study of flags and distinguish it sharply from other interests such as flag design. Smith's so-called principles of vexillology, or at least they argue people who are interested in design and also interested in scholarship should simply be wearing separate hats when they do the two activities. On the other side are folks who want to embrace the whole gamut of flag-related interests under the banner of vexillology. The second debate concerns the best practices of flag design and whether we should be trying to pin down a definitive list of those practices. This paper takes on both of those debates. First, it argues for a broad view of vexillology. Genuine scholarship is a valuable part of what flag enthusiasts can do, but it need not be, and it never has been, or could be, all of vexillology. And even the scholarly dimension of vexillology should be broadly defined. Now, in this respect, I think I'm preaching to the choir. The more controversial question I'm going to deal with has to do with flag design, because the paper also argues for a generous view of flag design. There are better and worse flags, we all know that, but we should not try to reduce those judgments to rules. More important, this paper will try to connect those two questions. The scope of vexillology, one question, ideas about flag design, the other question, and I'm going to try to connect the two. Some would argue that if vexillology is to be a scholarly discipline, it should not be in the business of judging flags at all. Again, if you want to do that, just wear a different hat. I've already said that I think that vexillology should not be defined that narrowly, but I also want to argue that there can be a scholarly way to consider how to design good flags that work in their time and place. But that requires thinking more deeply about what we mean by scholarship and what we want out of flag design. So my third proposition, I once had a professor in college who taught a whole course on how to give speeches. And his basic proposition was, you should always have 3 parts. So I'm simply following that rule. So my third proposition is that better understanding each of the debates I discuss in this paper, and again, the two debates are the scope of vexillology and the principles of flag design, better understanding both of those should give us a key to making sense of each other. Understanding each debate can make better sense of the other. So let's begin with the debate over the proper scope of vexillology. Whitney Smith envisioned vexillology as a scholarly scientific discipline. But he also had an especially narrow view of what he meant by that. I'll get back to that in a minute. But the first thing to notice here is that by any definition, much vexillological work is not actually scientific or scholarly in any genuine sense of the word. There are important exceptions. Look at any issue of Raven, but those are exceptions. Those are exceptions. But this is not a criticism, right? And again, this is not a criticism. Much of what vexillologists do is not scholarly, but this is not a criticism. It is, though, an important observation. The best and most genuine contemporary scholarship states a thesis. It makes an argument. seeks to persuade. It criticizes, it is critical, and it contributes to an ongoing scholarly conversation. Scholarship, in short, is not only descriptive. Some scholarly disciplines are nothing but arguments. Other disciplines do build their arguments on careful descriptions, but those descriptions are only evidence out of which their scholarly contributions emerge. So consider history. Academic historians have been trained to distinguish chronicle, which is what their predecessors did hundreds of years ago, from real academic history. Chroniclers try to give an exact description of what happened, or a plain narrative of events, but the scholar aims not merely at saying what happened, but in some sense also explaining it. The academic historian digs up facts and organizes them, but then tries to shape them into a coherent narrative that has a punch, an explanatory punch, or a set of claims that transcends the narrative itself. That also requires selection. Good historians, much to their personal agony, but they're trained to do this. Good historians leave out most of the facts that they have gathered. If they were not selective about historical facts, then in the words of one theorist of academic history, if they were not selective, they would end up producing a Lewis Carroll-style map of the country on the scale of a map of a mile to the mile, right? And similarly with vexillology, right? The description of a flag should not be as big as the flag itself. Or consider astronomy. Amateur astronomers are important. They discover comets, they notice unusual stars, their work contributes to the field, but amateur astronomers are still different from professional astronomers. Many academic astronomers don't spend much time with telescopes. They often play with mathematical models. Again, my point is not to belittle the amateur astronomer, but only to distinguish him or her from the professional counterpart. Similar differences exist in other fields. None of this is new or should be controversial. And in fact, it's sort of the standard stuff of academic thinking. When I wrote my first real research paper in high school, I worked hard to discover a whole set of facts, and I dumped them all on the paper. And my really wise teacher, to whom I'm always grateful, my really wise teacher in high school, had to explain patiently to me why I didn't get an A. Because I thought I had found all of this stuff and I put it all in the paper and it was a great paper. And she said no. And when she got really exasperated that I couldn't understand, she said, "It's bullshit." This is in high school. So what about vexillology? The blunt reality, right? The blunt reality is that while some examples of vexillology are in fact serious scholarly contributions, a lot of it is not. A great deal is only descriptive. It does not propose an argument. It does not state a thesis. And again, this is not a criticism, right? This is not a criticism. Descriptive work can furnish important data. More important, it can be fulfilling for its own sake. It's fun, right? That's why we're here. It's fun. Astronomy buffs are not astronomers, but they're doing what they love, and that's great. The same is true for enthusiasts who hunt down and describe flags. Vexillology is a wonderful hobby, and hobbies are eminently respectable activities. All this, though, should make us more modest about embracing Whitney Smith's grand vision of vexillology as a, quote, scholarly discipline, embracing that vision as the only model for our common efforts as vexillologists. Because if we take that model too seriously, then we have to realize that most of what gets written and presented by flag enthusiasts would not be vexillology. And Whitney Smith himself argued precisely that. So with respect to the first question I posed at the start, relating to the scope of vexillology, we should just loosen up. With all due respect, right? With all due respect to Whitney Smith. Nevertheless, even if most of what passes as vexillology is not scholarly, in the full-blown sense I've been emphasizing here. Some does inspire to genuine scholarship, and that's okay too. So the question is how we might achieve that ambition. Whitney Smith, as I said, did not only want vexillology to be scholarly, he also had a very limited view of what scholarship should look like. Smith thought of vexillology as a branch of political science, more narrowly as a branch of the type of political science that tried to formulate and prove testable hypotheses. He had this sort of very positivist view of scholarship, of political science, of vexillology. But genuine scholarship, right? Genuine scholarship, even the sort that I've described, is not that narrowly defined. Historians, literary scholars, anthropologists, aesthetic theorists, they make arguments. They're real scholars. They state a thesis. They extend the conversation. They engage in informed criticism. They try to persuade, but they don't necessarily prove or even propose testable hypotheses in the sense that Smith wanted. So to summarize what I've said so far, not all vexillology needs to be scholarly. If it is scholarly, it should try to make sound arguments, state a thesis, and extend the conversation. But contrary to Whitney Smith, even scholarly, genuinely scholarly vexillology need not be about proving a testable hypothesis. Right, you have all that. So in the meantime, let's move on to the second debate about flag design. And here I might lose some of the choir. Right? The current orthodoxy is reflected. Here's Ted, right? The current orthodoxy is reflected in Ted Kaye's work trying to distinguish good flags from bad flags, which is not only enormously influential among flag aficionados, but has become a Bible of sorts guiding flag design competitions. On the other side are voices who argue that Ted's principles are too narrow and rigid. I contributed in a small way to this debate in a 2008 article, Flags in Context. And there I argued, for one thing, that there are serious problems with each of the principles. I just went through them one by one and suggested there are not only exceptions to the rule, but that the principles themselves had deficiencies. But more generally, I argued that Ted's principles neglected the role that flag genres play in the history and aesthetics of flags. More recently, Ted and NAVA produced a new edition, so that this is the old edition, and then they produced a new edition of good flag, bad flag that added the quotation marks and emphasized that the principles were guidelines and not rigid rules. But nevertheless, right, you tell people something is a guideline, not a rigid rule, they'll still treat it as a rigid rule. So as more American states and cities have held competitions to design new flags, the judging criteria for those competitions still tend to stick to Ted's criteria. In my view, at least, the result has been mixed. Individually, right? Individually, some of the new flags adopted by states, cities, and the like have been not just good flags, but great flags. I love the new Minnesota flag. I really do. And I love it in part because it breaks some of the rules, right? But I love the new Minnesota flag. But think of the whole collection of new flags, right? So think of not just Minnesota, but Cedar Rapids, Evanston, Dayton, right? Go on. And you'll see what I'm talking about. There's a problem. As I suggested in my paper, there are many genres of flag design. And over time, those genres have come in and out of popularity, and they've evolved, and they've changed, and they've competed. Each of those genres has a history, has a set of stylistic assumptions. Good flag, bad flag is best thought of, in my view, as illustrating one of those genres and illustrating it very effectively. But it should not be thought of as a master guide to flag design, at least in my view. Because if one genre squeezes out all the others, we lose as much as we gain. So one thing we lose is the historical depth that flags can provide. Nobody loves the so-called seal on a bedsheet, but it would be a shame if every last seal on a bedsheet were replaced by the sort of simple geometric design favored by good flag, bad flag. For example, the current flag of Pennsylvania, my state, is not a great flag, but it does evoke some of the Commonwealth's histories and roots and ideals. Compare it to one proposed alternative, the so-called Keystone flag. I'm sorry, but what does this flag say? And what emotions can it hope to evoke? I, for one, actually prefer David Phillips' effort back in 1984 to design new flags. And his strategy was to take existing flags and extract their heraldic elements. So that's his new flag of New Jersey. Compare it to the current flag. Not bad in my view, not bad. So let's try to tie together these two debates, right? These two debates that engage vexillology. Can and should vexillology be a scholarly discipline? That's the first debate. What, and if so, what sort of scholarly discipline? Second debate, how do we think creatively about flag design? In connecting these two questions, consider a quip by Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson said, "There's no great merit in telling how many plays have ghosts in them and how this ghost is better than that. You must show how terror is impressed on the human heart." And in making this argument, he was actually praising Edmund Burke's work on the sublime. So the first part of Johnson's claim that there's no great merit in telling how many plays have ghosts in them, that echoes my discussion about the definition of scholarship. The second part of his quip about how there's no great merit in saying whether this ghost is better than that ghost, it echoes my second argument about flag design. But his conclusion, right, I think, suggests a way forward. You must show how terror is impressed on the human heart. So that's about ghosts. But I think there are equivalent ideas about flags, right? You must actually say something, right? You may say something about flags that evokes what makes them important and significant for all of us. So vexillology has many elements. Some are scholarly, some are not. That's okay. But when vexillology does aspire to be a scholarly enterprise, one direction that it might take is to articulate a scholarly account of flags as flags, right? So not wearing two hats, putting the two hats together. This account would not look to political science and sort of testable hypotheses. It would look to the humanities. It would look to the study of literature or art. The goal would still be to make an argument, right? Literary scholars, historians of art make arguments, not testable hypotheses. But the conversation would be focused on flags as a special type of visual object. This sort of study would effectively integrate the love of flags on the one hand and their study as a subject of scholarly inquiry. So along those flags might be especially productively compared not just to literature and art, but to music. Music activates many emotions. It's aesthetically profound. It's not easily reducible to a pamphlet, right? Nobody ever wrote a pamphlet, good music. I mean, I'm sure somebody did. Right? I'm sure somebody wrote a pamphlet, good music, bad music. But we ignore it, right? Music activates many emotions. It's aesthetically profound. It's not easily reducible to a pamphlet, as I said. It's neurologically complicated. This summer I heard a series of lectures about the neurology of music. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. And I'm sure there's a neurology of flags that somebody could study. It can have important political, sociological, and psychological dimensions, right? You know, just like flags, music evokes, right? Evokes all sorts of things. And we can, I think, learn something from the study of music. We vexillologists are well positioned to think deeply as well about the subtle ways that flags can work. The scholarly dimension of vexillology can, among other things, try to understand and evaluate the aesthetics of flags to help us think about what makes flags beautiful. flags are complex subjects. They can and should be aesthetically pleasing, but they can also comfort, right? They can comfort. They can give us hope in the face of tragedy. They can unify a diverse society. Technically, when the flag of South Africa was first introduced, some people hated it, right? But it's done its job. It's done its job. It can symbolize fortitude and courage. To do full justice to all that flags can be, the vexillological world needs to be open, trying to develop a sophisticated aesthetic sensibility informed by the complex history of flag design as an artistic, political, and symbolic practice. An aesthetic theory of flag design might include the sort of considerations of flag genres that I discussed in my earlier paper, but it would go well beyond that too in ways I can't even begin to imagine. So vexillology can and should have many elements. Some are scholarly, some are not, and that's okay. The scholarly dimension of vexillology, right, that piece of vexillology that is, quote, scholarly, can, among other things, try to understand and prescribe the aesthetics of flags to help us think about what makes flags more beautiful. But it's an applied aesthetics, right? It's still scholarly, but it's an applied aesthetics. It should be grounded in arguments about visual design and practical use. It should be sensitive to history, politics, and psychology. A broader vision of vexillology can embrace both a serious scholarly effort at analyzing the many dimensions of flags and their aesthetic, emotional, political, psychological, and symbolic richness, and also an aesthetic sensibility. So the scholarly piece and the aesthetic sensibility. And that aesthetic sensibility should be rich and open-ended enough to be the proper subject of the scholarly analysis, right? If you want a rich scholarship, it has to have a rich subject. We need a rich and sophisticated practice of flag design. We also need to realize the design of flags can be nurtured, right? Can be helped along if it rests on a rich and sophisticated scholarly foundation. And these two pieces, it seems to me, are connected, right? We can have a more sophisticated way to design flags if we have a rich scholarship of the aesthetics of flags. And the aesthetics of flags can be enriched if we have a deep tradition and a sort of deep and diverse tradition of flag design. Thank you.
I could just throw out a couple things. You mentioned studying the neurology of flags. A scholar named George Pash put out a couple things in the Flag Bulletin in the 1980s, but there's been 40 years of neurology since, so probably it's worth revisiting that.
I do know that some of the study of the neurology of music has been helped along by fMRI studies, right? And that technology has only developed in recent years. And one of the questions that they've tried to study with respect to music is, well, what's the relationship of music to language, to spoken language? And it turns out it's a complicated, overlapping sort of relationship, not necessarily one that one would expect, because there used to be two schools, right? One said that essentially music and language are the same human activity. Maybe language grew out of music, right, hundreds of thousands of years ago, or the other way around. The other view is that they're just totally separate, and it turns out that the truth, of course, is somewhere in between. So one might wonder, so how does the neurology of flags relate to the neurology of art? Just going to a museum and looking at paintings. Does it evoke similar responses in the brain or different responses in the brain? And the answers to some of those questions, or at least the tentative answers to some of those questions, because these answers are always tentative, right, might help us think about the next flag, right? And why, at least in my mind, the Keystone flag doesn't do it, the Minnesota flag does, right? Why is that? And I'm not so scientific as to think that neurology can give us the answers, with a capital T and a capital A, but it might give us something to mull over. Ted.
Harry, I want to thank you for advancing the discussion of this. I think it's wonderful. And I get undue credit for the 5 basic principles of flag design articulated in Good Flag, Bad Flag. I'm actually the compiler of the consensus of flag design thoughts of 20 different people. So I want to reduce my association with them. They are not my principles. They are of many vexillologists. I want to give them credit.
I will adjust the draft accordingly.
You're not the only one to either advance or pillar review based on principles. But I want to ask, given your thoughts of this, what advice would you have for groups, states, cities, or others who are thinking about updating their flags?
So one thing I might do, right, is sort of illustrate to them these different genres, and maybe explain, how these different genres can work effectively in different contexts. So what do you want to do with your flag? I was just thinking, because I was sort of contemplating a question like this, right? I was thinking about the relatively new flag of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, which is a relatively new flag because the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom is a relatively new institution. And it is a seal on a bed sheet, more or less. But it's quite beautiful, right? And it's quite beautiful in part because the seal itself is gorgeous, right? It has a sort of real heraldic sensibility, but it's not heraldic in an old-fashioned sense. It has the flowers of the four nations of the United Kingdom, really quite gorgeous, in a circle, and then there's a crown on top. And interestingly enough, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom never flies the flag of the United Kingdom, because that would offend the folks in Northern Ireland, which is one of the 4 nations, right? So they only fly their own flag, but it's a seal on a bed sheet, and a beautiful one, right? So you might criticize it in all sorts of ways. One of the reasons, among others, that it's appropriate to that institution is that it doesn't fly anywhere else, right? It just flies in the courtroom and over the building and in a couple of other places. And that's a different use and might call for a different genre of flag design than a flag that you expect to be flying from every flagpole in town. You might also challenge folks who are thinking about flag design without prescribing specific rules. You might challenge them regarding their initial instincts, right? So their initial instinct is, well, we have to put the name of the city or the name of the town or the name of the state on the flag. Of course we do, rather than saying no lettering, because I think there are lots of great flags that do have lettering, right? So rather than saying no lettering, I would ask them, well, why do you want the name on the flag? And their answer might be, well, then how will anyone know that it's our flag, right? And then you get into a sort of conversation, right? And the next point in the conversation is, well, if you have a nice enough, beautiful enough, distinctive enough flag, you won't need to have the name on it. Do you still think that you want the name on it? And they might conclude no, right? But it wouldn't be on the basis of a rule, right? It would be on the basis of a conversation. And they might still end up deciding, well, yes, you're sort of right, but we still think we want our name on it. And sometimes that works. I think the California flag, by the way, is a great flag, precisely because it says California Republic on it, right? Because it evokes the history of California. It doesn't just say California, right? It says California Republic. That extra word, right? The extra lettering actually makes it a much better flag. If it just said California, would be a terrible flag, right? But it says California Republic. If I were a consultant to a group like that, I would engage in a conversation rather than beginning with a set of rules. And I might say, look, there are these different genres, right? So maybe you want a heraldic flag, right? You're a city in Maryland, right? Maryland has a beautiful heraldic banner as its state flag. From the sort of strict point of view of good flag, bad flag, it breaks some of the rules, but it who can just draw it from memory, right? Nobody. But it's universally thought of as one of the great US state flags. And that's partly because it fits into a different genre than the sort of geometric flags that we've become more used to. And you might ask a city in Maryland, well, you want a heraldic flag of your own? And if so, what sort of traditional heraldic symbols do you want on it? And it might end up being a very, very complicated flag with 6 or 7 or 8 colors, right? But it would situate that city as a place distinctively associated with the state in which it's located, right? With Maryland. So those are and again, I wouldn't if I were a consultant to a committee like that, I wouldn't describe that. I wouldn't say to a city in Maryland, you have to have a heraldic flag. I would ask them, would you want a heraldic flag, right? And would you be inspired by the state flag to have your own heraldic flag? And if they do want a quote seal on a bed sheet, one question I might ask them is, well, can you make the seal on the bed sheet a little more interesting, right? The New York City flag is a great flag, right? It's a seal on the bed sheet, except it's also a tricolor. I think that's not just fine. I think it's great because it evokes the Dutch history, right, of the place in a very effective way. And yes, it has this complicated symbol in the middle, and right, but it's still a great flag. And if they just want a logo, I might argue with them about it, right? But maybe at the end of the day, they want a flag that that they could also use on their stationery, right? And again, that's not the view I would take, but we would have a conversation. Rutgers, to my great regret, this isn't about flags; it's about brand forms. Rutgers just changed from what I thought was a really elegant, historically resonant set of symbols to a simple block R, which I think is just atrocious. And I had this whole back and forth with somebody about it. So it's simpler, but it is, at least to my mind, ugly as hell. And I refuse to use it as my email signature.